I have spent enough time around money to notice a pattern that most people never quite name correctly. A lot of people know how to earn. Very few know how to cross over. They work, they get paid, they learn how to survive. Some even learn how to make a decent living. They may become competent, they may become respected. They may even become impressive inside the narrow world of their profession. And yet, years later, they are still standing on the same side of the line. They have income, but they do not have wealth. They have movement, but they do not have lift. They are touching money all the time without ever really entering the layer where money begins to behave differently. That layer interests me because this is where most people get confused. They assume wealth is simply income continued long enough. I do not think that is true. Income matters, of course, but wealth is not just a larger paycheck stretched over more years. Wealth is a change in relationship. It is the moment money stops being something you merely receive and starts becoming something you command, preserve, position, and deploy. That is a very different game, and the trouble is that many people spend decades getting better at the first game while never learning the second. That is why some people can earn well for 20 years and still have so little to show for it. Not because they were lazy, not because the world was perfectly fair, and they somehow missed their chance, often because they never crossed the internal line between labor and capital. That is the line I care about. The labor side of the line is where most people spend their whole lives. You give time, you give energy, you give attention, you collect compensation. There is nothing wrong with that. It is honorable, it is necessary, it is how most people begin. But if labor is all you ever understand, then your life with money remains fragile, because labor income stops when you stop, because labor income is taxed as effort, because labor income tends to be consumed by the current version of your life if you never build anything stronger than the appetite around it, because labor, left on its own, does not automatically become ownership. This is what people miss. Money does not become wealth simply because it passed through your hands. It becomes wealth when it survives you long enough to organize itself into something durable. That is a major distinction. A paycheck can disappear. Capital can remain. A salary can pay bills. Ownership can create options. Labor can finance today. Assets can negotiate with tomorrow. Most people do not cross into that second layer because nobody taught them how. They were taught how to be responsible. They were taught how to pay bills. They were taught how to stay current. They were taught how to avoid embarrassment. They were taught how to perform adulthood, but they were not taught how to think like someone whose money must eventually stop behaving like wages and start behaving like retained power. That requires a different education. The first part of that education is this: you must learn to see the difference between flow and stock. Most people understand flow. Money comes in, money goes out. That is the whole mental model. But wealth lives in stock. What remains, what accumulates, what is owned, what is protected, what compounds, what still belongs to you after life has taken its bite. If you never train your mind to care about what remains, you can become very good at managing flow and still stay poor in the deeper sense. This is why I do not admire the person who is merely busy with money. I admire the one who is quietly retaining it. A lot of people touch impressive sums over a lifetime. They just never trap any of it. It flows through them like water through a wide pipe, fast enough to impress, too fast to collect. This is why I have always believed that one of the most underrated financial questions in the world is not how much do you make. It is what portion of your effort escapes consumption and turns into retained capital. That is the real question. Because once retained capital exists, your whole relationship with life begins to change. Now you are less dependent on every immediate outcome. Now you can say no more often. Now you can think better because pressure has softened. Now you can take better risks because you are no longer risking collapse with every move. Now you have runway. Runway matters much more than people think. Most people assume money buys luxury. Sometimes it does. That is the least interesting use of it. The more important use is that money buys room. Room to think. Room to wait. Room to reject bad deals. Room to build something without demanding that it feed you instantly. Room to survive a wrong step. Room to avoid panic. That is why retained capital is so precious. Not because it flatters the ego, because it protects judgment. A person with no retained capital is easier to rush, easier to scare, easier to underpay, easier to trap in urgency, easier to convince that every opportunity must be taken immediately, because there may not be another. I do not like living that way, and I do not think anyone becomes wealthy while remaining permanently vulnerable to that kind of pressure. This is why I have so little patience for the culture that confuses visible earning with real advancement. A person may look successful and still have almost no room, a nicer apartment, a newer car, a few better dinners, a little more polished wardrobe, a little more expensive life. That is not necessarily wealth. Often it is just a costlier version of dependency. And costlier dependency is still dependency. If I were teaching someone how to cross over from earning into wealth, I would begin by asking them to notice every place where their life is consuming their own escape. That is what many lifestyles do. They eat the very margin that could have become freedom. This is why I think the conversation around hard work is so often incomplete. Hard work is useful, hard work matters, but hard work without a system for retention is just energy sold into an appetite. The appetite grows. The worker stays tired. The years pass. The numbers look better. The structure barely improves. That is not a wealth story. That is a stronger engine inside the same old machine. And the machine is what eventually matters. What system receives your effort? What system protects what is left? What system turns surplus into reserve, reserve into runway, runway into better decisions, and better decisions into ownership? If that machine does not exist, then a raise often just means better consumption. I have seen this happen countless times. Someone gets promoted, their income jumps, there is excitement, there is relief. There is a sense that now, finally, things will change, and they do change. The restaurant choices improve, the travel gets slightly nicer, the car payment expands, the neighborhood becomes more expensive, the sense of identity becomes more costly. Then 3 years later, they still feel strangely exposed. That is because income changed. The machine did not. Crossing over requires a machine, and a machine begins with literacy. Most people are trying to win a game they cannot yet read. They use credit without understanding what credit really is. They borrow without understanding cost of capital. They work in companies without understanding how value is perceived and priced. They talk about investing without understanding risk. They talk about entrepreneurship without understanding runway. They talk about wealth without understanding how human environments shape financial behavior. I have no interest in making money sound mystical. It is not mystical. It is structural. And one of the first structural truths worth learning is that access is often priced before ownership is. Credit is part of that. People talk about credit as if it were only a temptation or a trap. It can certainly become that. But it is also a measurement system. It is the market's rough attempt to ask a basic question: how reliable are you with capital that is not yet yours? Again, you do not need to worship that question, but you should understand how much of adult life quietly revolves around it. Rates, approvals, insurance pricing, housing applications, business terms, flexibility during emergencies. These things are not always determined by virtue, but they are often influenced by perceived reliability. And once you begin to understand that, you begin to see a second truth. The world does not only reward effort, it rewards trust, positioning, and understanding. That is why some people who look less hardworking on the surface keep advancing economically. They understand the code more clearly. This is also why I care so much about the ability to diagnose value. The average person thinks income comes from being busy. Often it comes from being useful in a way that is legible. That is not the same thing. Plenty of people are useful in invisible ways. They stay underpaid because the usefulness never gets translated. This is where another kind of crossover happens, not from labor to capital this time, from effort to leverage. The person who learns how to explain what they do in terms of cost saved, revenue protected, friction removed, risk reduced, or growth enabled becomes harder to ignore. The person who never learns this often remains trapped inside goodwill and exhaustion. Goodwill is pleasant. Exhaustion is common. Neither guarantees financial progress. This is why I think value must be articulated, not just delivered. If you make a company money, understand how. If you save it money, understand where. If you remove pain, quantify the pain. If you improve retention, conversion, customer trust, team speed, or operational simplicity, know how to say so. This is not bragging. This is translation. Translation creates leverage. And leverage is one of the great dividing lines between people who stay at the mercy of wages and people who gradually move into stronger positions. Now let me say something many people resist. Profit often lives closest to pain. The world pays fixers. It does not always pay them immediately, and it does not always pay them proportionately. At first, but over time, the one who can identify friction and remove it is usually standing closer to money than the one who only notices and comments. That principle is useful whether you are an employee, a freelancer, a business owner, or simply someone trying to become more valuable over the next decade. The habit of asking, "What is broken here?" and "What would it be worth to make it less broken?" is a very wealthy habit. It turns you from a spectator into a participant in value creation, and once you become a participant in value creation, money stops feeling like something distributed by invisible magic. It begins to look more like a consequence of reducing pain, increasing clarity, improving speed, or protecting someone else from a costly mess. That is much easier to build a life around. This is why I am skeptical of people who make entrepreneurship sound like a personality type. I do not think entrepreneurship is about the costume. I think it is about seeing where value is trapped and finding a way to Sometimes that happens in a company, sometimes in a small business, sometimes in a side operation no one respects at first, sometimes in a niche everyone else thinks is too boring. The form matters less than the pattern. See pain, reduce pain, retain value. That is a far better model than be your own boss slogans. And if you do choose to build something on the side, I would remind you of another truth. The existing paycheck is not always your enemy. It can be your runway. Runway protects thinking. It keeps panic from steering every decision. It lets you test reality without demanding that reality flatter you immediately. It lets your side venture mature before it is asked to replace your whole life. That is intelligent. A lot of people want a dramatic break because drama flatters the ego. I prefer optionality. Optionality is one of the quiet powers of wealth. It means you are not forced to decide under poor conditions. It means you can wait. It means you can reject. It means you can build. It means you can survive disappointment without immediate self-destruction. This is why retained capital matters so much, not as a scoreboard, as oxygen. A person with oxygen thinks differently. They negotiate differently. They invest differently. They build differently. They leave bad environments sooner. They tolerate uncertainty better. They avoid stupid urgency. That is one of the hidden ways wealth compounds. It is not just the money that grows, it is the quality of your decisions. And decision quality is not only personal, it is environmental. This is the part people least like to hear, because it means money is not only about numbers, it is also about people. The people around you affect your spending, your ambition, your habits, your sense of normal, your tolerance for discipline, your ability to stay calm. The environment around a person either supports retained capital or quietly consumes it. A household where money is always used to regulate emotion behaves differently from one where money is discussed clearly and deployed intentionally. A social circle that treats visible consumption as status creates different outcomes from a circle that treats quiet compounding as normal. A partner who brings chaos, secrecy, or misaligned values into the financial life changes your trajectory just as surely as an investment decision does. This is why I do not think relationship choice is separate from wealth. It is part of wealth. So are boundaries. Can you say no without needing a dramatic excuse? Can you stop funding every invitation, every expectation, every recurring leak that buys approval at the cost of progress? Can you distinguish generosity from self-erasure? Can you protect the machine you are trying to build from the emotional demands of other people who may never care about your future as much as you must? That too is wealth behavior. What I am really describing is a different way of seeing the whole game. Not as a contest of who works hardest, not as a beauty pageant for lifestyles, not as a race to look advanced. Not as a collection of isolated money hacks, but as a sequence. Learn the language. Understand credit and cash flow. Translate your value. Retain capital. Protect runway. Become a fixer. Choose environments that do not sabotage you. Turn labor into ownership. Let ownership become optionality. Let optionality improve decision quality. That sequence is how crossing over happens. It is not dramatic enough for the internet. It is strong enough for real life. If I had to reduce everything I know into a single practical lesson, it would be this. A lot of people do not need a bigger dream. They need a different relationship with the dollars already touching their lives. Those dollars must stop passing through as proof of effort and start accumulating as proof of design. And once a person understands that, they stop asking only how to make money. They begin asking how to keep, structure, and position money so that one day it no longer behaves merely like income. It behaves like power with patience. That is wealth, not noise, not flexing, not the costume. Power with patience. That is what I would build.